Hi, everybody. Hi, GDC. What's up? All right, cool. Welcome to our open world art creation talk. My name is Ryan Benno. I'm a senior environment artist at Insomniac Games.
I'm Brian Mullen. I'm a senior lighting artist.
And I am Matt McAuliffe. I am a material artist.
So we're really excited. We're really excited to talk to you guys today about how we created Marvel's Manhattan. This was an enormous challenge for our team, and we had to learn a lot of new processes as well as take a lot of the stuff that we had used in previous games. We brought a lot of new talent in, including my two fellow speakers here. So we're going to be breaking down this talk between the environment aspects, the material, and the lighting parts, and how those different teams all kind of came together to build the city. Real quick, just want to also say, we're all from Insomniac. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary a couple of weeks ago as a studio. So, we've made a lot of different games. Yeah. All right, there you go. So the studio's made a lot of fantastic games over the years. Obviously, not all of us have been part of that 25 years, but we're super excited to be talking about our most recent memorable game, Spider-Man, today. So, like I said, my name is Ryan Benno. I am a senior environment artist at Insomniac. Some of the titles I've worked on since I've been at the company include Sunset Overdrive, Ratchet & Clank on the PS4, and Marvel's Spider-Man. And I'll be covering the first part of how the environment team made Marvel's Manhattan one building at a time. So I wanted to start this off by talking about what our goals were at the beginning of Spider-Man. We wanted to create a living world. We wanted to capture kind of what the feeling of being in New York is, the busy hustle, how different the city will change from day to night, and how the city will evolve as the story progresses while you're playing through as Spider-Man. And throughout that whole process, the changes that we're going through should also reflect how the player is feeling and the mood and tone of what's happening in the story. Photoreal lighting and materials. Marvel's work has always had a very high visual quality bar for realism, and we wanted to kind of match that as well. It's something that we really wanted to nail with our lighting and materials. This was our first time really using Substance Designer as a team. We had used a couple other softwares before, but Designer was the program we decided to use for this project, and it's become very integral to everything that we've done ever since. And varied and diverse visual stories. We wanted to tell the diversity of New York through the different set dressing in different neighborhoods and the different boroughs. New York is a melting pot of people and neighborhoods. On top of our desire to make each district neighborhood feel unique from each other, we wanted to be able to capture those stories, the people, the businesses, the culture. This was an incredibly important goal for us to fulfill the Spider-Man experience being in New York City. So with that in mind, let me show you how we ended up with everything. So this is a quick video just showing some very early, really early blockouts of the city and what we ended up coming up with when we shipped the game last September. So that's where we ended up shipping after working on this game for a very long time. So how did we get to going from those blocks that you saw to the final fully arted city? So to talk about how we made Spider-Man, it's important that we go back and talk about our previous open world game, Sunset Overdrive. Sunset was the baseline of everything that we did in terms of building structures on the environment side. We could not have made Spider-Man without having that baseline knowledge and that workflow that we had developed through working on Sunset Overdrive. The main part of that is our modular building sets. So we broke our building pieces up between flat wall pieces, and a flat wall piece would be either a window piece, a door piece, whatever you would want it to be. An end column piece, which is just a vertical piece that goes along the corner of a building, a trim piece that sits along horizontally, and then an end cap for that. And from there, we also worked on having our metric sizes set. So we primarily worked in meters, and most of our building pieces range somewhere between 2, 4, 8, 12 meters. Occasionally, we had a couple 16-meter pieces, but very simple, really easy to work with. They can just snap to grid, and they just work, which is kind of the philosophy of a lot of our pipeline, is we just want stuff that is simple and easy to work with. We also used a technique called ultimate trim. I won't get too deep into it. Our former principal environment artist, Morten Olsen, did a talk at GDC 2015 about this online if you're interested. But on top of using a lot of tiling textures that we used on building kits and large surfaces, trim is a very essential part of our pipeline for creating assets. It's an incredibly versatile technique. It essentially is a standardized strip map, so the layout is consistent for any material type throughout, and it has a 45-degree bevel in the normal map, so you don't have to bevel in the geometry, so it saves you on geometry count as well. This is also the first time that we used Houdini. You will hear quite a bit about Houdini throughout this talk. It had very humble beginnings on Sunset, where we essentially just used it for our road and sidewalk creation, and also helping with some asset placement. We also had the streaming zones, or what we call tiles. On Sunset, we called those hexes, but on Spider-Man, we just stuck to the tiles. These are just individual levels that are being loaded at all times. We really wanted to make sure that the player felt like, for any sort of open world game, you need that type of streaming technology to be able to have everything be visible at once. And so this was our first time being able to work with that, and we translated it. Essentially, it's whatever part you're standing in the world, we load that tile plus the surrounding tiles. So it's the fully high-res geometry. There's no low-res geo in there. And then also we use world space UV-focused materials on stuff. So on Sunset, this is very prominent. If you take a look at any of the buildings that are in there, you'll see a lot of kind of paint strokey looks. Most of that stuff is all done procedurally using a world space mask for stuff. But on Spider-Man, obviously we didn't go with something as stylistic as that, but we used it for a lot of our grime across large surfaces of buildings. It really helps to break up any sort of tiling or just negative space that you'll see on like very large surfaces where you might just have one tiling texture going across everything. So this is kind of the baseline that we started with when we finished up Sunset and began working on Spider-Man. But after that, we wanted to kind of take a look at like what worked. We did a post-mortem and we were like, hey, like, what can we do to improve on the process? As well as also knowing we were going to be making a significantly larger city than we did on Sunset, not just from a landmass size, but a level of density that we had not done before. We're not even quite sure what exactly that level is, but it's pretty significant between the two different cities. So on that, we set a couple goals for ourselves in terms of what that process would mean. So even though we really enjoyed what we were able to do on Sunset, like I said, we needed to improve on that for the new challenge of working on Spider-Man. So the first one is we wanted to be able to integrate Houdini more into our pipeline beyond just road generation. We thought we might be able to use that to generate not just streets, but whole buildings. The other part that we wanted to be able to focus on was integrating that into how it would generate a full building and use our modular building kits. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a pipeline understanding of what our workflow process was on Sunset, from building block out to final art, a designer would go in and hand edit each block out, just using pretty rudimentary just shapes for stuff. But they would spend a little time figuring out what the style of the building they wanted it to look like, and then we would go in and cover the building up in 4x4 modular wall pieces, just like 4x4 meter pieces. And then from there, what we would be able to do is swap out any of the pieces that we have. We have some hotkeys in our own engine that allow us to very quickly swap models in and out for stuff. We change the materials and get the look of what we wanted it for stuff. So that was kind of the baseline of where we started with. And the modularization pass is what we would call covering the building up in the 4x4 pieces. And we wanted to find a way to streamline that so we didn't have to spend time as an art team being able to do that. So we could just get to the arting of the buildings. We also wanted to create more complex storefronts and have them be more varied. In Sunset, we had a handful of brands that were part of the narrative of the game that we wanted to just, we used in a bunch of different areas. But in New York, there's a ton of mom and pop stores. And again, it's a lot of buildings, a lot of different businesses on each of those buildings. So we wanted to be able to find ways to quickly make variety, but without adding brand new model instances and new textures to everything. We also wanted to change how we did our impostering system, and again, integrating that into Houdini. So an imposter is essentially a very low-res version of our buildings. Our buildings are prefabs made up of multiple different modular building pieces. And what we'll do is we'll take that prefab and create a low-res model that has a custom texture based off of the look of the building. On Sunset, we used another piece of software, but again, to be able to get it to be more efficient and work better with our engine, we switched over to Houdini for that process. And finally, but certainly not least, this is definitely the biggest challenge. We wanted to maintain our ability to spend time to polish and handcraft areas like we had on Sunset. But we had to find ways to help get past the repetitious nature of making buildings. Now that we had a significantly more buildings that we had to make throughout the game, we wanted to get past that part and get to the fun of the set dressing. That's always been kind of our goal, is like, how can we get past the repetition part and really get to the fun stuff? So, kind of like I mentioned earlier about the pipeline of like, hey, we have a designer going in, already kind of doing a little bit of a mini art block pass, and the artist would go in and modularize stuff, and then we would go in and do the final art pass on stuff. That's how we kind of started on Spider-Man. But we ended up running into a issue in that, which is that on Sunset, we had about 1 or 2 designers that were blocking out the buildings for us. We started off on Spider-Man with 1 designer doing all of that work. And when there are the differences in terms of just metric sizes for numbers, you might have at most maybe 3 buildings in a tile. In most of Spider-Man, you have somewhere between 5 and 8 buildings per tile. So it's a lot of work, and it just didn't make sense for the designer to be able to spend his time like arting all of that stuff out. So he would throw cubes around, be like, all right, here's a city block. I'm just going to throw a giant cube of what that building should look like. So when Houdini was spitting out buildings for us, you were basically getting these massive, huge, buildings in one style, which was not necessarily something we had thought about at the beginning, but when we began to art this stuff out, we were like, we need to find a way to break these buildings up. So we started hand editing that stuff, realizing it was just far too much work for us to be able to do that stuff. So this made making the buildings and editing the buildings a real pain to change the shape or the silhouette or anything, right? Like if you take a look at buildings in New York, you'll see a lot of tiering, you'll see a lot of cut-ins and insets. The design blocks were just cubes, so we weren't getting any of that stuff. And to be able to do that, it was just so much work to do it. Sometimes it just made more sense for us just to completely modularize the building by hand rather than use what Houdini spat out for us, which obviously defeated the point of us trying to use Houdini for that stuff. So we started looking at a couple different solutions. One of the ones that I brought up was using a tool that the design had been using to create some buildings that weren't just straight boxes. We had some buildings that were sitting on corners, and that tool is called the Polyline. So this is an example of what it is. It's a tool that we've had for a long time, but we never really used it on the art team, but it was something that Houdini was taking into consideration when it was trying to find a building prefab to build stuff off of. It's essentially a spline tool that you can extrude upwards, so as long as you get the metric numbers right for what your width height is for stuff, it'll be fine. So I started playing around with this, and I went to our principal technical artist, who was our Houdini wizard, David Santiago, which, by the way, he's doing a ton of different talks here at GDC, so you should definitely go see one of David's talks if you're interested in more the technical end of Houdini. And I was like, hey, Dave, how complex can we get with these polyline things? He's like, oh, you can get as crazy as you want with this stuff. And I was like, cool. So I did a test. It took me about 45 minutes, and then I realized I did it completely wrong, did it again, took another 45 minutes, and spat out a building like this, which was far more complex than anything we had had in the game at that point. Ran it through Houdini, gave me all the pieces, everything that I needed. So within 2 days, I had convinced the rest of the art department to say, hey, this is the way that we should be going with this stuff. So we changed the pipeline. So once design went in and had adjusted the building heights and widths of what they wanted, we would then go in and do an art pass, a polyline art pass on top of that stuff. The reason why this came about was just because we had more manpower. Like I mentioned, we had somewhere between 1 or 2 designers at a time that were working on the open world, laying out buildings, and we, as an art team, would have somewhere between 8 to 12 people on the open world at any point. So we just had more manpower for stuff, as well as also we wanted to have some control over what the look of some of the buildings were. So design gave us some guidelines of things that we could abide by, and that's really the focus of where we began with doing a large polyline pass over the city. On top of that, too, it was very quick to work in. You could do a polyline building somewhere between 5 to 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes if you have something really complex. And then you just run through Houdini and you get a whole building, and that's it. Let me kind of explain how Houdini actually creates building pieces for us or uses the building pieces that we have to generate full structures for stuff. So it would take our modular pieces that we had, the similar ones that I talked about from Sunset, and based off of a naming convention, it would know what a first floor piece would be, it knew what a wall piece was, it knew how to place a corner on stuff, it would create a custom piece of rooftop geometry, which was awesome, so we didn't have to spend time slamming a bunch of different planes around to kind of fill in the rooftops. And then also it would put any sort of gameplay volumes or logic on the building that we had typically always had to do by hand. So we used another spline tool to create any sort of traversal markup. Before we'd have to draw that by hand. As artists, Houdini would generate that for us on the fly. And then also we would use swing volumes for buildings. This is how Spider-Man's webs knew how to attach to the end of a building. So again, it was all stuff that just was, it would automate for us. It just made the process significantly faster to work with. So here's a couple examples of what Houdini would just spit straight out of once it took a polyline pass. These are done by one of our senior environment artists, Trey McNair. This probably took him maybe, I'd say, 2 to 3 hours to do, just to spit all this stuff. And obviously this is one neighborhood of a much larger space. So, but it's pretty cool to see just how complex the buildings can be, and it gives you a good baseline for stuff. And so just as a way to show hey, here's what the blockouts would look like, and then it would go to this, essentially. Obviously, once we had the buildings in place, we would then go in to those prefabs, swap out any pieces that we wanted, swapped out storefronts, windows, changed the materials. The process didn't get us all the way there, but it got us more than halfway there in terms of getting the baseline for everything in place. So then again, we could just focus on making sure we were able to polish and do a proper art pass on everything. So once the modularization pass was done, artists could go into building prefabs and be able to edit that stuff. And then on top of that too, kind of like I'd mentioned earlier, the imposter system. This is what we ended up using to generate our final buildings. On the image on the left, you'll see 3 structures. The image that's on the far left is the imposter. The building in the middle is the actual prefab. And then on the right is a proxy model that Houdini uses for a bunch of other different functions. And so it's pretty cool. It's really fast. It's really yeah, you can get these buildings done fairly quickly. And so with that, it then gives us time to be able to customize that stuff. So we can add additional structures to stuff. So like with this building here, adding in a lot of the Roman columns and a lot of the different pieces on top of the roof. Houdini spat out the majority of these pieces just to kind of start with. And here's a couple examples of some of the art and like the time that we were able to then spend polishing stuff instead of us focusing on just repeating the repetitious acts of modularizing and getting the designer markup in place, which could take just as much time as doing the polishing pass. Some of these are shots from one of our other environment artists, Oscar Gonzalez. And yeah, you could do a whole neighborhood pretty much in an afternoon, and then go in and just, do a nice little proper art pass with some polishing there. So ultimately, what did this all buy us? Going procedural saved us a ton of time. We no longer had to do a modularization pass by hand for buildings. Houdini generated all traversal gameplay and markup for us. This allowed us more time to set dress and do multiple polish passes on the open world. And then some hard numbers on sunsets, our modularization pass by hand could take somewhere between 30 minutes to 4 hours for a single building. And we cut that down with Houdini to about 5 to 15 minutes. And then total building in the open world, we're actually not quite sure what the exact total number is, but it's over 9,800 buildings in Spider-Man. So you start doing the math of that stuff, you're like, oh yeah, that's a pretty significant amount of savings for stuff. So the next bit I'll talk about is the storefronts. So our goals, we wanted to create low-level street interest for stuff, even though in the game you're spending a lot of time on rooftops and you're jumping around stuff. We still wanted it to feel like New York, and a lot of New York is the dense diversity of different storefronts and models that were in there. And we also wanted to be able to have the storefronts reflect different parts of the city that you were in, whether you were in a residential area or a different business, or if you were in a Chinatown or Harlem, those different types of areas. So what we ended up doing was just creating a few facade fronts that we're using primarily Ultimate Trim, again, and a lot of tiling textures. These could be easily set dressed to create a variety of different storefronts. Again, if you take a look at a lot of the architecture and styles that you'll see of storefronts in New York too, a lot of them are kind of the same architecture, so it's just like, hey, we can change the materials here, or change the signage, or change the set dressing. It can feel like a completely different storefront. Kind of like I mentioned, we can do a lot of different material changes. And again, this also saved us on unique instant count. One of the reasons why we were able to kind of really do a very dense open world at the amount of stuff we're constantly streaming is because we were very cognizant of how many unique models, materials, and textures we were drawing in at one time. If we can create a bunch of very versatile assets that we can use that are drawing in a significant amount of time, and then allows us to then put those resources into adding more unique models and textures and materials where we need them. And again, the pieces abided by our regular metric sizes. Most of these storefronts were about 8 meters tall, and the average size, I think, was somewhere between 8 meters wide and 12 meters wide. Here are some examples from one of our associate environment artists, Carol Torres Gonzalez. She did these pretty much in a day. So it was just, taking the storefronts, putting some set dressing, changing the signage for stuff. So the other thing that we wanted to end up doing very late into the project was we wanted to add state changes for the storefronts as well. So based off of whether you're playing the game during day or night, certain businesses will be open or closed. There are other events that end up happening in the game, I won't mention if you haven't played it yet, where the storefronts also go through a change as well for stuff. And so the way that we ended up doing that was, since all the storefronts could be made into prefabs, so an artist can go in, do the set dressing of it, change the materials, add signage, save that as a prefab, and then we can call in from our vault or our asset browser. What we could then do is put a secondary prefab that had all the day set dressing and all the night set dressing inside of it. And then Houdini was able to then take that information and apply it in a bunch of different ways that would allow us to turn those states on and off whenever we needed them to. We could even change the graphics on signs if we wanted to. We ended up creating a process that had a texture atlas that could randomize somewhere between 8 to 16 different signs, or we could also just put in specific quadrants if you wanted to get that stuff. So again, it gives you a lot of different variety. And again, we're saving on texture because we're only using, I think we only had maybe 5 custom signs for a lot of our signage in the game. The other thing that we ended up doing too to kind of help save on time, because we did eventually need to do a couple unique storefront facades for different neighborhoods, was creating a, what like I call the BitKit file. So we realized that a lot of the architecture pieces we were using, windows, doors, walls, columns, were all kind of the same, and we could at least get something started to save us time to model the stuff. So I made a file that had a bunch of pre-UV'd assets. I actually got this idea from Bungie, who did this for a lot of their weapon designs for stuff, and being able to create a kit that would just be able to make modular pieces out of stuff. So it's kind of the same thing, much simpler. And that was able to save a lot of time because, again, you may not have the fully finished thing, but it gets you like 60 to 70% of the way there in like way less than half the time. And then finally, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we did some of the set dressing and how we broke that up. It was really important to us to be able to set specific themes and tell the story of New York and make the districts feel completely different rather than it just feeling like a very generic, boxy building city all across the way. So, like I mentioned earlier in the talk, it's really important for us to evoke the wide variety of cultures and places in Manhattan. Not only is it true to the area, it just gives us more variety and fun things to play with, different stories of things, and it keeps the artists interested and excited to be able to work on, if you're set dressing buildings for years on end, you need something to kind of get the blood going a little bit and, get people excited and invested in their stuff. So we really dove into the history of each of the major districts in Manhattan. We wanted to find ideas that were representative of those places, and then we would create a central theme for each of the districts. We ended up breaking up the city into several different zones: financial, Chinatown, which is most of the East Village, Greenwich Village, Midtown, Hell's Kitchen, Upper East Side, Upper West Side, Central Park, and Harlem. And then from there, we actually broke up the districts into smaller neighborhoods, and then one artist would be in charge of each of these neighborhoods. We would then also take the theme that we had for the central area and try to find ways of exploring that theme in a variety of different ways, whether that was something in a residential area. Maybe we'd find an area that was kind of a little contradictive to that theme, but still fed back into that same idea. Again, it gave artists a lot of opportunities to be able to come up with unique ways of set dressing and thinking about the things that they were going to be making. To make sure we weren't going too far off of the style of the buildings and the districts we wanted to go to, we made sure that there was a template for the team to be able to work off of. So this is what we would call a beautiful corner or a visual target. We would use, as well as style guides and art direction Bibles to help brief people on that stuff, but what was really helpful was seeing an area in the game that actually looked arted. So this was the visual target that I did for Greenwich Village really early on. This would also give us time to be able to make custom pieces and brand new pieces if we needed them. So we didn't really have a lot of stoops at the time. So we ended up having some stoops made. We changed some new windows and building pieces, and then obviously doing a set dress pass. And this was really a great way then for the team to say, okay, cool, I have an idea of what the general vibe, color scheme of the buildings, heights, and what the set dressing should kind of feel like. And then this is kind of what you would end up getting and seeing some other artists being able to evoke this stuff. And that's going to be the end of my session here. I'm going to just give you guys a couple different things to consider as like the final takeaways for this. Open world games are really hard and they are a lot of work to do. And so especially, at this scale and the size of the team we had, we only at our max working on the open world team for all of Spider-Man, it was about 15 of us and probably floating somewhere between 12 to 8 at any specific point during production. It can definitely feel overwhelming, but it's something where you need to start thinking about how do you break that stuff up in smaller segments and try to find ways to still hold stuff at a high quality bar, but not spend a incredibly long time worrying about smaller little props. Looking at the overall big picture for the city is incredibly important. Using your resources wisely and focusing first on big ticket items, and then once you get that stuff in place, you should be able to have the time to then focus on smaller details. Find any sort of repetitive processes you might have and see if you can try to automate them, either through using existing tools like what we did with the polyline, which was like, we didn't even know that was a thing until we started using it, or forge with brand new tools or new material sets. It really does save you on time and saves you from the boring droll of having to do the same task thousands and thousands of times. What you're really trying to do with all of this ultimately, though, is making sure that you save time for your artists to do what they're meant there to do, which is make stuff look really pretty and make the audience feel really engaged with the stuff that they're making. That's really kind of what the key takeaway with all of this is that, hey, it's a lot of work to be able to get that stuff in there, but we want to be able to get people and the artists to spend time to develop these spaces in interesting and compelling ways. And if we're spending half of our time doing the same task or repetitive stuff, you're not going to see that in the final product. Continuing on that idea a little bit, using a handful of versatile assets that are drawn in most of the time to save on memory and unique draw calls is an incredibly important thing to do as well. And again, it can save you either on overall memory or it gives you room to be able to play with more stuff. And go procedural when possible. The future is now. With tools like Houdini and definitely with Substance, which Matt will be kind of getting into, these are really great non-destructive ways of being able to work. We did a lot of late changes in development, kind of like I mentioned with the storefront states, that we would have not been able to do at all if we did not have these tools in mind to be able to help us. So I just want to say real quick thanks to Allegorithmic for having us here today. And now I'm going to pass this off to Brian, and he's going to talk about some lighting.
Hey, guys. All right, so my name's Brian Mullen. I'm a senior lighting artist at Insomniac Games. One of the major things I worked on in this game was setting up the atmospheres and the look of the lighting for our open world. What I want to focus on today is a bit more of the foundation of what we set up to get our, before we started doing our beauty lighting and adding layers of post effects. I'm not going to focus on every aspect of our initial setup, but what I do want to focus on are kind of like the first steps. And these first steps aren't really specific to our tools, so this should be transferable to whatever you're working in. We had a really big city to work on, and we did not have a really big lighting team to do it. Knowing that, it was clear that we needed to kind of create some pillars for what we wanted to accomplish so that we could stay focused. The first item was that we needed to make sure that our lighting was contributing to the environmental storytelling. We didn't have dynamic day-night changing open world lighting in our game. And I have to say that allowed us to get very specific about the look that we were going for, and it helped us immensely in being able to tune that look. Given that we're telling a fairly linear story that drops the player back into the city frequently, we're able to let our lighting kind of assist in the storytelling that's going on. And then second, it's using real-world measurements to validate our work, but then balancing that with gameplay issues and visual targets that we have. So first off, we have to create that foundation, and we have to get numbers that we can validate against stuff that we can measure in the real world. But we also need to keep in mind that by adhering to that, sometimes we're going to come up with problems, and we need to be creative with how we solve those things. We frequently see situations where what we know is physically correct may still be making it hard for the player to play the game, and it could still be not hitting our aesthetic goals for what we want. And this, kind of being a lighter is about trying to strike a balance with this, and this shouldn't be like news to anybody who's been a lighter before. But I think some of the most successful lighters are the ones that display patience when these problems come up, and they can work with the other departments, understand where they're coming from, and approach the problem solving with nuance instead of trying to club it by addressing a couple of atmosphere properties and end up fixing one problem and create 45 more. So originally I wanted to talk a bit more about our procedural setup in this for lighting in the open world, but fortunately we already have X-Ray, who's a genius, and he's going to be here on Thursday talking about some of what he did to help us out. Removing a lot of that manual process from us allowed us to kind of focus more on our beauty lighting. And David Santiago is also going to be here later this week. Ryan talked about him in his talk, and he's going to be here on Thursday at 10 a.m. And super smart guy. I would recommend going to both these talks. So about the foundational steps I mentioned before, the very first step before we dive into the deep end and start trying to light all of New York is we need to set up a content validation level. Here's where we can get ourselves a strong starting point for the setup of our atmospheres, but then it also becomes a ground truth for the material artist and environment artist to drop assets in and compare what they're seeing there to what they're seeing in the rest of the game. We originally tried using like a section of the city, but because materials were constantly in flux, what we found is we had better results if we would just go with a gray plane, maybe a box for like a room that a player could go into, but try to keep it as simple as possible so this kind of lives away from the rest of the game. And it's important to realize that when you do your balancing and your setting up of your atmosphere and this content validation, it's not necessarily just going to make a perfect translation over into the game that you're working on, especially for us when we were working on New York. In a small test level, there's nothing really blocking light contribution coming from the sky from all directions, but then you go into New York and it's basically all occluders. It's just buildings everywhere, bridges everywhere. Any atmosphere that I had looking beautiful in like a little test level, when I bring it over there, it's not just gonna work. But I'm in the ballpark and I'm typically just nudging settings one way or the other. I'm not kind of starting over from scratch when I move over there. So before we get into the atmosphere settings that we're gonna dial in that content validation level, we need to kind of go outside and take some real measurements so we know what to validate against. So this step's really simple, but you will need an SLR camera and you need a gray calibration card. The gray calibration card you can buy at like any photography store. Make sure your camera's in manual mode so your exposure is locked, and then photograph a gray card in direct sunlight, and then take it over to a shadowed area and snap off another shot, and don't change any of the exposure settings. For our daytime reading, we used an f-stop of f.8, and for sunset, we did 5.6. After you're done getting these shots, open them up in Photoshop. What you're trying to find out here is how much brighter was that card in direct sunlight than the one that was in shadow. And this will give you a lighting ratio. In Photoshop, what I did was I just remove all the saturation from both of the images, and then I do an RGB reading of both cards. As an example, if the card had an RGB rating of 160 in direct sunlight, and then that one in shadow had an RGB rating of 10, I have a 16:1 ratio, which is what we had for our daytime readings. It wasn't these exact numbers, but the ratio was 16:1. For sunset, our ratio is substantially lower because it's at 2.5:1, and this makes sense because the sun's lower in the sky, cutting through more atmosphere. So once you get those measurements, you now have a target that you need to try to match an engine. In engine, we lock our adaptation just like we did with the camera. You put an 18% gray card to act as your in-engine calibration card in direct sunlight, and then one into a shadowed area. Basically, just mimic what you just did outside. Before you jump into baking GI, confirm that your exposure is correct too. You need to look at that 18% gray card in direct sunlight and make sure that it's reading as an 18% gray card. And if it's not, you need to adjust your exposure a little bit. In our tools, we bake our GI. We do a round of that, capture a reflection probe in the area, and then we get a reading of those gray cards. If the gray card in direct sunlight is more than 16 times brighter than the one in shadow, you probably want to increase the brightness of the sky a little bit and do another round of baking. It's all about trying to get that contrast ratio kind of up a little bit. It's the opposite if the contrast ratio is too high. I've never actually seen that, but if you did, you would just turn down the skybox and rebake. Once you have your ratios reflecting real-world values, the next step is now unlocking that adaptation by introducing a little bit of a range. In our tool's adaptation range is how many stops up or down from that base that you originally set as. Ideally, what you want to see is enough adaptation range that when you go to that card in shadow, everything lifts up enough that it now reads as an 18% gray card. You might find what we found, which was that it can produce some nice results, but that much adaptation when you have a 16:1 ratio can actually create some kind of visual issues, but it's still a place where you would want to start. So in Spider-Man, we had 4 locked lighting conditions. I'm going to run through some of the quick processes and problem solving when it came to each one. The first time of day that I wanted to discuss is what we called day. It was our midday lighting setup. It was around noon. Day was our test bed for a lot of our open world procedures, so most of our workflow was kind of established on this one. And this one ended up proving to be a bit more problematic than some of the other ones, so dealing with these problems kind of right off the bat helped. So our goals for day were to make a rich, vibrant lighting setup that hit the hyper-realistic look that made the city feel varied and gave us the cinematic look that we wanted. To do this, we used a very blue skybox and an ever so slightly warm key light. The indirect shadowed areas would get a soft blue color to them from the skybox. And all of our values were pushed then by adding a LUT that increased the vibrance of the colors and introduced just a little bit of contrast. While I do like LUTs, and I do think that they can create great looks, they proved to be somewhat problematic in a game of our scale, so we had to be somewhat restrained in how we approached them. So Day did have a few issues to work through that all kind of came back to that really wide 16:1 contrast ratio that we recorded. Before firing off lighting for the whole world, we would pick a few beautiful corners and different boroughs in the city. And what I was finding was a 16:1 ratio definitely looked realistic, but I don't know that it looked, good. So what specifically wasn't working was with a really high contrast ratio. That means if a player were standing in a really dark alley and you were adjusting properly, everything that was bright was now clipping. So you would be standing in an alley and you would look out and the sky was just nuclear white, and every building in the background getting hit by white was just, or by the sunlight was just white, and everything was blooming, and it was kind of a nightmare. The other problem was when you're adjusting that much on your dark range to get everything kind of evened out, was that Spider-Man can move really fast, and he can move up and down, and he's on rooftops, he's running up the side of buildings. With the way that he was moving, the screen was constantly adjusting between dark and bright and dark and bright, and it was really disorienting to play. We could have slowed that timing down a little bit, but then you were still going to have visual issues where maybe the sky just looked off while you were falling down. So what we found worked best was to stop trying to make a 16:1 ratio work and try to find a ratio that balanced a little bit better for us. And we ended on a 10:1 ratio. That allowed us to have less aggressive tone mapping and helped with the issue of our blown out skies and shadowed areas looking pitch black when you were standing outside of them. These things were still kind of there because it's what you want to see. You do want to see these areas getting bright. You just don't want to see it clipping. The next atmosphere I want to talk about is sunset. Sunset follows much of the same process that I already detailed with day, but it did introduce some unique challenges and some great opportunities to push the quality bar through our post-processing. Sunset on our game was always the most fun to work on because sunset just inherently always looks good. Golden hour pushes warm and cool complementary colors, and it makes for a beautiful environment. Our ratio for direct to indirect lighting was 2.5:1, so we're already not dealing with almost all of the problems that we had in day. Using a nice blue saturated skybox allowed a good amount of cool lighting to get baked into the shadowed areas, which created this nice color balance. Our engine has these fantastic tools for God rays, which we're able to utilize to great effect. And then we brought in more volumetric fog than we had in the day atmosphere. And then that combined with our God rays to add this nice separation between a directly hit area and a shadowed area. And we were able to implement a system for driving our fog, our distant fog, with the texture, and that allowed us to get more control than we'd previously had. Sunset did come together pretty nicely, but it did have some weird challenges. For one, the sun is coming in at a raking angle, so even a small gap in geometry in a building is more likely to be noticeable to the player. And tracking which building is leaking the light can be terrible because that building might be 5 tiles away and not even loaded when you're working in the engine. The problem was exasperated late in the project when we decided that we were getting better results by lowering the key light a few degrees. Tackling this issue was a collaborative effort with the environment team by fixing obvious seams and tackling the more tricky areas by using a light blocker volume. I mentioned this earlier, but sunset in any setting is obviously a pleasant time to look at, so as silly as this sounds, part of the problem that we had with sunset was that early on we'd hit a target and it looked really nice and we were just like, all right, done. And the problem was that we could have done more and we decided to go back and do more, and I'm glad that we did, which was kind of trying out some different skies, seeing what we could get baked in, how many different colors we could start introducing into this, and then figuring out how we could use a LUT, again, somewhat restrained, but what we can do with a LUT to kind of push this thing to go even further. So whereas sunset is always visually appealing and easy on the eyes, overcast is extremely tough sell. Gray, it's just gray everywhere. People don't generally like overcast. People don't like being outside on a rainy day. Surprisingly, I found overcast to be more of a fun challenge on the lighting end than I had anticipated. It didn't hurt that our amazing tech guys and core team created some great rain and wetness effects that really made this thing come together. Our goal in overcast was to make this look bleak. If you played the game, the overcast is the atmosphere that the player sees during the low points of the story. We needed to help support that story beat, but also try to make an atmosphere that still allowed the great work of the environment team to be seen. We achieved this look through a few steps. First off, we kept the key light on. It's barely noticeable, it's very low intensity, but it definitely, its presence was felt, and when I tried to turn it off, it was gross. Everything had this nice little shadow, and it made everything feel a little bit more grounded. Our spec just looked better. Everything just looked better with it on. It's a pricey thing to pay for, but it was nice to have on. The issues are kind of what you would expect. It's gray. I had just finished working on Sunset, which is the most colorful thing in the game, and now I'm trying to sell everybody on, look how great all of this gray looks. And so earlier I mentioned how restrained I like to be on the LUTs. This is still true for Overcast, but this is the atmosphere I was able to do the most with because the base was already so neutral. For Overcast, I increased the vibrance just a little bit, added a little bit of contrast, and then I shifted all of the color towards green. The end result was an atmosphere that felt bleak and also supported the story while visually hitting the cinematic bar of what we wanted. The bigger issue with Overcast was making sure that our sky wasn't constantly blown out. When I mentioned earlier about trying to validate values, you drop a gray card in that open world and you try to get it to read as an 18% gray card. But at street level, when most of your light is coming from the skybox and almost all of it's being occluded by buildings, I ended up having to turn the exposure on this skybox up extremely high, and the end result was I could get a good balance, but the sky just always looked white. To get around this, and we were able to do this because we're making a Spider-Man game, I balanced to a rooftop instead of the ground. This is okay in Spider-Man because he can go anywhere. You might theoretically spend as much time on a rooftop as you are at the ground. So we balance to a rooftop, we don't have all these occluding buildings, and then our light is able to kind of get in there without me having to crank values to something unrealistic. And after we get a balance on a rooftop, we take that 18% gray card down to the street. We introduce enough adaptation so that those areas will boost up just a little bit. You'll end up with a sky that is a little bit brighter, but it still has detail, and that will only really cause any blooming and clipping when you're in a super dark area. Okay, so night. Night in an open world game is interesting. While all of our other atmospheres were dialed in, trying to stick as close to real world values as possible, night is the hardest one to stick with real life on. We tried to because it was very important that night look like night to us. It was one of our pillars for this atmosphere. So I'm going to go through some of the steps on what ended up being the most difficult lighting condition for us. The goals were that night needed to look like night. It couldn't be a day for night look. We didn't want like a blue wash over the entire city. We needed it to look and feel like night. And we needed to make sure that this city felt alive without adding 500 lights to every single city block. And we needed to make sure that all the crimes were visible. And we needed to make sure that all the backpacks were collectible. And everything else. Everything needs to be visible. So first step was the key light. The key light was set at a very low intensity and angled just a bit. Originally, we tried a more top-down angle from the moonlight. It just didn't look natural. It alleviated a lot of problems, but it looked weird. So eventually, we just kind of angled it a little bit more, and it helps with when Spider-Man's up on rooftops. There's a lot of crimes that happen on rooftops, and it allows us to not necessarily need too many light sources up there. But it didn't help us at a street level, which is where we really needed it. So to address that, we started setting up our prefabs. This includes any wall light sources, and most importantly, our street lights. Street light prefabs were broken out into each district, each one getting its distinct color temperature range to their packaged dynamic lights. For instance, Hell's Kitchen had warm street lights, ranging in temperature from 3,200 to 4,000 Kelvin, while Financial District had a more LED lighting setup with temperatures between 6,500 and 7,300 Kelvin. This helped give a subtly different feel to the lighting in these areas from the most substantial source of light that we had available. We also set it up that if the player were to look down the street, they wouldn't see every single light to set to the exact same color. It's a subtle thing, but it seemed to work for us. Much like Sunset, also pushing our post effects were integral to making our night lighting work. We introduced some God rays coming from the moon, which exaggerated some dynamic-looking light coming from the moon. We introduced some volumetric fog and bloom to the overall look, and that was allowed us to push this look of light pollution that you would expect to see in a city like New York. So obviously, night is going to introduce some difficulties, so let's dig in. The first issue I want to talk about is a biggie, and that's how we found a balance between making night look and feel like night and not having a game that was entirely too dark to play. One of the revelations I had early on while working on night was that the atmosphere was never going to hit the bar of what I wanted it to look like if I tried to address every single problem that was going to come up. So we kind of made a decision that we were just going to let our dark areas be dark, and then we would circle back and address those. We'd stop trying to find some magic tone mapping setting that didn't look weird and still made the game playable. So we ended up relying on our prefabs a lot, and those played a major role in getting that last 10% to look playable and to still look nice. I'll be digging into this in a minute, but streetlights would contain a bake-only light and a runtime-only light, with the bake light being extremely wide with a large attenuation radius to push as much bounce light into the area as possible. This allowed our street-level areas to look like the image that you see over here, not getting too high contrast and not having very small pools of light. Once we had a lot more bake at a street level from this setup, we found that our tone mapping also started functioning a little bit better in what we would expect to see. There were a few minor tweaks to the amount of adaptation range and timing after the new prefab lighting approach went in, and that helped smooth out some of the transitions. These steps got us most of the way there, but from there we had to deal with dark areas on a case-by-case basis, working closely with the QA team to identify problem spots where a crime may spawn or a backpack may be located, and make sure that we were adding light sources close to those areas. And while this process did create a fair amount of manual work to fix up these dark areas, I believe the end result was better for it. We dealt with the issue with a scalpel instead of trying to bludgeon the problem with a hammer by figuring, we'd be able to find some magic global setting that would be able to fix this. I feel like if we'd kept trying to address this through the atmosphere, we would have ended up with that day for night flat look that we were trying to avoid. And aside from the visuals, the next big issue was performance. Because our city's so large, we had to utilize a streaming system that would load the immediate area around where the player is. This created a few issues that we had to come up with solutions for. How do we get landmarks lit up if the player won't be able to, or if the player isn't around them, how do we have those lights loaded? How do we prevent lights from fading on constantly while the player is quickly swinging through the city? And then how are we going to afford to have all of these lights on in the first place? So one at a time. Our landmarks and distant building lighting, we worked with the environment team on coming up with creative solutions. We were able to utilize a global zone that the lights would go into with a hard cap of 500 lights, which sounds like a lot until you light the Empire State Building and realize that took 30 lights to light up. And now you've realized that you've now got to start thinking about how you're going to do this. We needed to pick the landmarks everybody would expect to have lit up and address those first. Then we had to hit the story points, GCT, Grand Central Terminal, I should say. We had an auction house that was important. We needed to start hitting the story points. And then whatever we had left, that's what we would start moving into the buildings that weren't necessarily as important, but added to the visual look. So for preventing lights from fading on, and for performance, we addressed those with what I mentioned before. By having a bake light and a dynamic light in all of our prefabs, we're able to have a lot of contribution from these lights, but the dynamic portion of it wasn't really on until you were within 30 meters. The runtime light is also, it only casts shadows when you're within about 15 meters, I believe is what we set it to. The cone angle is much more aggressive. You don't really see it fade on at any point though, because we've already baked a contribution in. It's being obscured somewhat by the fog. And what you end up seeing is in this image on this next slide is this whole street going down both sides it looks pretty well lit up, but I only have 2 dynamic lights on right now, and they're the street lights that are in the center closest to us. So our performance never, I shouldn't say never, but it most of the time did not have any real issues, despite the fact that we were trying to make this entire city look lit up and alive. So the thing that I want to talk about before wrapping this up is what I learned by going through all of this is that even when you know that you're going to have problems by sticking to a PBR workflow and trying to do your lighting right, that is kind of where you have to start. We knew with a contrast ratio of 16:1 for day that we were going to run into problems. And we knew with night, if we tried to stick with real world values, we were going to run into problems. But we did those things first anyway, because it's easier to deal with problems when you have expected results that you can measure against outside. It's important to get your foundation set up right. And then you can deal with all the weird stuff that comes up. It's one thing artists have to deal with regularly are requests that don't necessarily line up with PBR and what you'd expect to see in real life, and that's okay. While it's good to be diligent about your process and making sure that you're sticking with real-world values, it's also important to keep an open mind about how you resolve creative issues that are being brought forth. It's worth mentioning again how a good workflow is going to get you most of the way there, and in most cases, as long as you're not trying to solve these problems too early in the process by changing a global atmosphere parameter to something that doesn't really make any sense, you shouldn't really need to go too far from the PBR script to get something that works for the betterment of the game. So that's going to be my portion of this. I'm going to bring Matt over here now to do his material stuff.
Thanks. Ooh. Hello. All right, that's loud. Sorry. Hey guys, my name is Matt McAuliffe. I'm a material artist at Insomniac Games, as we have previously covered. And so I'm going to kick this off with just a little bit about myself and how I got started at Insomniac, because it kind of plays into a part of designer, and saving time was the biggest thing. So, brought out in 2017, Spider-Man's been going on for a little while now. Most of the content in the game, from textures, models, assets, were in at some form. So everything, kind of the foundation, has all been laid out. We have our content, but there's a few issues. So the first thing I want to talk about is excessive texture assets. Typically what this came down to is textures that were a little bit redundant. They were too close to others in the set. There wasn't enough visual difference to justify them there, and memory was already an issue, so we needed to tackle this. Shared assets and duplicates, same thing. If you have like 3 textures for brass, but to the anyone else who just looks at this and says, hey, that's brass, that's also brass, this is also brass, but you look into it, they're all sourcing 4 different 2K textures or anything like that. Performance starts to become a little bit of a problem, and you start getting flags go up. So The other thing that was in need of addressing was large surfaces. These are really tricky to deal with, especially if you have such an expansive world like New York. Sidewalks are huge, roads are huge, buildings are huge, rooftops are huge. Everything is big and everything is a problem, but we can figure this out one step at a time. So the immediate goals after we got there, prioritizing was huge. We didn't have that much time, came on, towards the end of the project, so we need to figure out what is the biggest bang for our buck, what is gonna give us the most returns for our time, and also our resources. Fielding requests as needed for specific missions, scenarios, and locales. So that means as we were approaching, wrapping things up, there were certain cases where we'd be reusing content from other areas, or say we take a cobblestone and we apply that on a wall because we didn't have like a stone texture set like ready to go. So we use it as like temporary placeholder. So figuring out which one of those guys is most in need of an update, a complete refresh, or anything else was really important. Increasing the quality and flexibility of the content, which all feeds right back into making sure that what you have in there is useful in a variety of cases, and it prevents people from making duplicates, redundant textures, or just offshoots that maybe satisfy one or two scenarios, but in large kind of just pull away resources from where it could really make a difference. Validating and fixing content was also really big. So as you have a whole lot of materials, a whole lot of people touching a whole lot of stuff, it's pretty easy for things to get a little bit out of hand in terms of settings. I'm sure if anyone here has messed around in a material editor, sliders are dangerous, and you can clearly go off the rails very fast, myself included. So reining in a lot of that stuff was really big to make sure, it's a lot of content, it's good, it can pass, it works, it looks great, but sometimes settings over time were a little bit too light, a little bit too dark, more saturated, too desaturated, and you just kind of gotta go in and tweak those guys. And then the last thing was to create a library of approved textures and materials. And I'm going to go into this a little bit later, but essentially the approved idea is that we have a system where we can tag content that is in our engine. As this has been vetted, we know it works well, and it helps artists make confident and informed decisions. So the first thing that we were jumping into is big variation, which meant that we needed to cover a very large surface, hit a certain textile density, but also introduce a lot of variety. So one of our senior technical artists, Chris Perella, made a wonderful blend shader that I then proceeded to use on pretty much every single thing I could get my hands on throughout the rest of the project. And from things like marble inside of Fisk Tower to the exterior of Raft, this was used extensively throughout Spider-Man. The PBR validity zone and the debug that we used in conjunction with this. So we had a big, essentially neighborhood with roads, a few buildings, sidewalks and stuff that all this kind of played into. You'd go and you'd look at it in there, make sure all the settings were appropriate, see how it looks in the big picture, bring back an engine, and you kind of go back and forth to make sure that everything is looking okay across a variety of scenarios. All right, so the blend shader itself. So all the texture content that I was feeding into this came straight from Designer. So that means free height maps, and you right away have a pretty good base to start blending a few different things. Our base, we essentially had 3 blends and then of texture sets that we'd work with, which is base, which is our bottommost layer, red, which is the layer on top, and then green on top of that. The blue channel we used for painting puddles throughout Spider-Man, and this was done, like all these channels that we could use, it was either done through vertex color, or it was done through a 3D texture that we used. That was a small guy that you could then scale up and then multiply against the height maps within the texture content to help increase variety throughout the entire city. Let's see here. The blending method is independent for each layer, so you could use either the 3D texture or the vertex color, and so this played a huge part of our pipeline because, as Ryan was talking about, Houdini was leveraged heavily. So that means a lot of the roads, the sidewalks, had vertex color generated by Houdini, so that way as we generate puddles, the vertex color for the blue lines up with the vertex color on the roads, so puddles and everything will go across multiple surfaces to help sell the unified look and make sure that water was where water should be. Inside the blend shader itself, most blending that we used involved dielectric materials, which freed up the green channel, which we previously used for a spec map. We could then plug in our height map in there, and that height map is what was used to generate a whole lot of different kind of looks and effects. So things like different noises were added into the height map channel, so you'd be working with your actual height map, and you could add a few different effects, patterns, grime, noises, anything on top of that to help the blending sell a certain look or effect inside of that particular material. One of the things that was also leveraged heavily was the gloss histogram controls. So I'm sure if anyone here is using Designer a lot, histogram range is something I use pretty much day in, day out. It's one of the most useful features I found in Designer for not just height maps, but gloss. So bringing that back into the engine means that when you're authoring content, you can create a lot of things that are a lot more high contrast and a lot more detail in there. So like an easy example would be I have steel. The default steel that we authored out it's gross, it has a lot of grime, smudges, scratches, everything on there. And then so when you kick that out into engine, if some artist is like, this is a little bit too much for me, I need to knock this back down, it needs to be a little bit more new, more polished, they have the gloss controls in there ready to go. They can reduce the range, make it more rough or more shiny, and you're still using the same texture set with no additional cost. The texture memory that we saved from doing that, we cut out quite a few variants of steel, of different things like paint, stone. Like we went pretty aggressive with this because it allowed us just to get a lot of free reuse, especially when memory was a big concern. The other thing that we were doing is within the blend itself, you could also use the histogram controls and other stuff to affect the ambient occlusion. And so as you can see on the wall, it's a little bit hard to tell with it, a little small guy up there. But the walls, based on the blend, so the 3D texture was used here, and so as thicker paint or newer paint goes on, it's the brighter one. The AO is actually faded out and reduced. And as you go to the older paint, which is the more kind of yellow, gross guy, the AO comes back in. And that's all just using the same texture set blended in against itself, just set at different parameters. So different hue saturation, different normal intensity, different AO intensity, and the gloss being altered, which is a really cheap and easy way to get free bang for your buck. And that was used extensively on the exteriors of buildings for any sort of brick that was painted, interiors, used on grounds, and a whole lot of other cases. So each independent controls, so we had diffuse HSL controls per blend, AO intensity, histogram range controls, normal intensity, opacity, threshold controls for each layer of the blend. So we had a whole lot of options, and so this is a little bit of a double-edged sword, because the more things that you provide an artist, the more chances there are for something to go wrong. So if you give someone 18 sliders, you're like, oh man, this is sick, I can do literally anything. And you go hand someone else that, and they have no idea what opacity threshold underscore RG underscore 002 is. And then, next thing you come back is a message in Slack saying something's horribly wrong and it's broken and I don't know what to do. And you go over there and you're like, oh no, I don't know what to do either. And then it's a little checkbox. Someone just accidentally hit invert and you're like, oh, everything's okay now. But for that 20 minutes, you were breaking out into cold sweat because the thing that you swore was definitely working was not working. So it's good in that way that you give people the ability to really get creative with how they use this content that you provide them, but it also means that you need to educate and try to streamline as much of it as possible and make it as easy for the end user to use. Because if you hand them the textured content, but you don't teach anyone how to use it in the shader effectively, you might not get the results they're really looking for. So going into prioritization, so getting all this kind of textured content in a relatively short time meant that we needed to identify a few key components in terms of what are the biggest problems, what are things that we wish we had a little bit more variety on, and what are things that we just in general see the most. So we went through and essentially gathered a list of the most used textures and material files in the game. We worked with environment and tech art to identify out of that list what are the most important targets and what to hit first. So at the end of, I think we took a week to figure out essentially what we wanted to do. And our list turned out to be mostly roads, sidewalks, rooftops were the big ones, and then buildings like for the brick. How to get more variation on that without having to have someone go and art everything, put decals on every single little corner just to get a little bit of variety. And these, fortunately, were all great cases for the blend shader, which we could, once again, they could either go and paint it, could either be generated from Houdini, or we let a 3D texture handle the heavy lifting and do the blending for us. So that meant that we had to work very closely with environment art because when I came on at this point, I was the only dedicated texture artist for environment. So that means really sorting through and making sure that when some request comes in, you know exactly what someone wants, you know how it's going to be used or where it's going to be used to prevent the back and forth of I was expecting this rock to be 3 times this size, I didn't want this to be that shiny, and you didn't understand what I wanted at all. And then you are just a sad person sitting in your corner wondering why you spent 20 minutes just tweaking that little slider just to get that gloss just right. And they didn't even want it glossy. It's no one in particular. It's just, I'm just thinking to myself, I've done this.
I'm very sorry, Matt.
It's okay. So to speed that up, essentially we used Trello at the time, so making cards that had very specific breakdowns of these material requests helped a lot. So large, medium, and small feature callouts, references, descriptions, they really helped align expectations of, hey, this is what I want, and for me to go, okay, here's what I can get you, and to help really minimize the back and forth. And also to know exactly where it's going to be used and how they would want to use it in conjunction with other content. So whether it's not it's going to be used in a blend shader, it's a one-off, it's going to be used on props, or any other case. And here are some examples of brick, because every substance artist needs a brick texture, and I got to make one for New York, so I had to put it in there. But so this was one of the first things I got to work on. It was a great example of working with someone, small, medium, large shapes. They knew that we needed, essentially you could input any kind of pattern and it would kick it out, the grout and everything else would work with it. And to focus on specific features within the brick to sell the area that this was being used in. A lot of this stuff ended up being used in the docks and areas near the water. So really kind of made it gross and nasty, and we'd go back and forth collecting references to make sure that it felt grounded, it wasn't too gross, and that it worked well with some other texture sets that we used within the blend shader. Here is a ceramic tile that we also used inside of Feast and a few other areas. The same thing, making sure that someone needs a specific look for this guy. We ended up using this also with the blend shader blending against itself using just a few different HSL controls and some gloss changes, and it looks far more complex than it really is, which is you're just kind of faking people out. Just touch a few sliders and it looks like there's 2 different texture sets, which is ideal because you're saving time and resources. And then dirt, because everyone also needs a giant ball of dirt. This was also another one where height map and normal intensity changes in the shader really helps sell the kind of back and forth, like it's been stepped on here, it's not stepped on here. There was a section where the normal intensity was reduced, and that area, like people were walking on it, they stepped it down. That gets a little bit more glossy and a little bit lighter. The darker and rougher, bigger clumps of dirt was definitely significantly rougher, and so just blending that once again against itself really helped push, get rid of any sort of excess textures. We got what we needed, and it was just, it removed any sort of excess, and we definitely needed to free up memory. So the next thing outside of those few cases in the roads, so rooftops and buildings. This was a tricky case because it's very easy to have certain settings for the 3D texture, which was used extensively on the rooftops and the sides of buildings, for it to work in certain examples, but not others. So going back and forth between different scale buildings means that the 3D noise needs to be tiled more or less when it's multiplied against the height map to make sure it was reading appropriately. The vertex color generated by Houdini was only used for roads and sidewalks. All the buildings and the rooftops themselves were either hand-painted in some cases or generated by this texture. The other thing that should be mentioned is that the sidewalks and the roads, while we had figured out that we were going to use Houdini to do all the vertex coloring for it, for the blends, it kind of became problematic when we were looking at how does this interact between our districts where we wanted variation. So specific asphalt was found in Greenwich versus Hell's Kitchen versus wherever else. So at the points of intersection, we ran into a problem where the material that had 3 different asphalts and the material that had 3 different asphalts in Hell's Kitchen versus Greenwich, or whatever location, because I'm terrible at, I don't know what places actually line up in New York, so I don't know if that's the right districts, but it's just an example. They wouldn't align. So when you hit that border, you get a gross seam. So we were trying to figure out what to do on that case. And the solution was every road material within Spider-Man shares the same bottommost asphalt material. So the other 2 blends could be used for any unique texture, with like rubber patches. You could have paint on it. You could have chunks of asphalt missing. Those 2 texture blends were free and open to use whatever you want, and it was used to help make an identity for that specific district. And then so as you go towards the borders, wherever that was intersection, in Houdini, the vertex color would be faded out entirely, so that way it's the one texture that's shared across all material blends. Then here is asphalt balls. So everyone loves material balls. Is what we come here for. And then, so like these 2 examples, the other thing that was really cool with working with Designer is that a lot of these are derivatives from one core material. So like rubber and our asphalt and pavements, a lot of this came from the same core graph. And then with a few quick tweaks, you were able to go between something that was relatively new, freshly paved, to destroyed, damaged, and deteriorated. And then working between those 2 guys, because they share so many features, you could change the specific ones that you want to make sure that it's not too similar, while making sure they still felt grounded and that they belong together. Another thing that we found while working on this project is the dangers of operating in a vacuum. It's really easy to get into looking at something at a very specific lighting condition, an angle, different application. With this marmoset, you're looking at in the designer viewport or a specific spot in engine. You don't check it anywhere else. This means that you may think everything's great, A-OK, but it really doesn't work in other cases. So the content validation level, AKA our acid zoo, we had it up and running, but it wasn't quite used that much towards the end of the project. And it's something that we could have capitalized a little bit more on. And so working without any sort of ground truth, an environment that you can confidently look at content in and make sure that, hey, if it works in here, it should work everywhere else. And if it doesn't, then we need to go investigate that specific spot that's being used in. So working back with Brian on that, we actually touched back on updating the content validation zoo, and we started going through and vetting all of our content throughout that. And this was done in conjunction with a PBR validator, which would flag materials if their diffuse reflectance was too high or too dark, their speculator wasn't correct. And it would at least be the first line of defense to let you know if something was wrong. But the one thing to note, though, was that just because it is plausible, like if it doesn't get flagged something, it doesn't mean it's necessarily good. Like, so there was a lot of cases where something would be super saturated or too bright, but it was still within the realms of being physically plausible. And then we'd have people asking, well, why doesn't this work? It's within our specifications. But that came down to more of aesthetics and art direction. So like I said, it's a first line of defense, but it's not the final say, and it definitely requires investigation to make sure that everything is working all right. So when you give people and provide them this kind of validation level, they can make more confident decisions, and they can go in on them themselves, because we're handing them all this kind of content that we generate from Designer to make sure it's being used appropriately. So when you give these guys the validator, the asset zoo, and the ability to essentially vet their own problems and figure out what is working, what isn't working, it really helps people make more confident decisions. It really gives them more agency as an artist to figure out and experiment with what you've provided them in the shader level, and for them to be creative and do what they do best. And so now into Designer itself. This was my first project being a dedicated texture artist, so it was a whole roller coaster of emotions of learning new things, failing, breaking more things, and then maybe figuring it out. And so here's just a few things that I walked away with from this project that really helped me out a great deal. The first thing was, when I first started, everything was an exposed parameter. Everything needed to be controlled. Everything had a slider, and it became immediately clear that this was way too much and it was overwhelming. So avoiding being too parametric was a big deal, like after we got going a little bit, because we'd be handing content back and forth between people. And if you want to make any changes to graphs, if those parameters are exposed in the graph and you delete that node, you start getting flags, it starts yelling at you, and unforeseen changes can occur. So one thing to do to remove all of these, essentially this huge list of parameters, is to combine a lot of them. And that in itself has a few different problems that can be addressed. So if you have, say, a master control for something like aging, and you want to work with a slider that's from 0 to 1, 0 being clean, 1 be gross, this has been left out in the rain for years and years and years, and you want to control multiple factors within that. So the 0 to 1 slider makes sense, it's intuitive for artists. 0 is none, 1 is all the way. But that doesn't really work all the time if you're trying to blend between some materials or, say, add rust to something. So in the image up there on the right, it is the function, the empty function control on a node where I'm adding rust to steel. And so at this point in the graph, I was unable to successfully just use that one parameter, the 0 to 1, to control that. So what I did is I fed it the float that was my age master control into a power function, so it's no longer linear, saturated it, and then used that to drive a lerp between 0.79 and 0.42. And all that was for was just controlling the middle point of a levels node. And so at first, when I had hooked this stuff up when it was just 0 to 1, and it was linear, it was essentially, the surface was becoming rusty and disgusting at like 0.2, while everything else had not caught up to it. So you have to change the, essentially the curve of different nodes to make sure that everything kind of operates how you want it to. And usually that meant working from the grossest stage of the material back. So everything, once you saw like your endpoint, like this is how rusted I want my surface to be. It was far easier to work my way back and see how much I had to reduce stuff to figure out what that curve was going to be, and then apply it to each of the related nodes and materials. Embracing the min, max, and clamp options within Designer 2, this was something that was incredibly helpful, especially feeding content to Painter or to Substance Player or any other software that can access the SBSARs or just the relay parameters. Within the clamps, you can essentially put a nice hard stop to type in values, which a lot of the times if you've set something up to work in a certain way and someone like, here's my where, I want to work from 0 to 1, and someone types in 3, sometimes that can spit out some unexpected results. And so by embracing this, you can kind of make sure that, as you hand off your creation that you spent hours noodling with, trying to make sure that it is as best as it can, that as soon as you don't hand it off, immediately it comes back as like, I typed in 3, and now everything looks horrible, and why have you done this to me? And it really just helps, like, once again, it's all about enforcing confident decision making for anyone else who accesses the content. Because if you're not the one who's making it, then it can be a little bit difficult figuring out the different kind of options and what is and is okay to use. So putting in hard stops within the controls themselves is a great way to make sure that it stays within the expected range that you've designed it for and that you've set it up for, and that doesn't go off the rails. Within the production of I-20, or Spider-Man, yeah,
Spider-Man.
code name. So throughout the entire project, I would say probably, I think we ended up with over 30 custom nodes generated over the course of the entire project. And a lot of that stuff came down to a lot of repetition, things that we use all the time, noises, grunges, things that could be fed mesh inputs, so like curvature maps, world space position. A lot of things that were done time and time and time again were then compressed into individual nodes that tried to follow a standardized layout of, like, you call the same thing like intensity across all these different nodes, threshold, opacity. The more consistent I was with these nodes, typically the easier it was for anyone else to understand immediately what it was. And by giving someone, hey, here is a noise node, they know immediately that there's going to be at least a random seed, there's going to be a contrast and a position control. It helps build a relationship between you and the artist so they know that, hey, if I get this, I know what I can expect, I know what I can do with this, and it helps them figure out what they want to do with all this kind of stuff. The other thing that was done a whole lot within Designer while you're working through this, especially with the back and forth through critique and whenever you got feedback loops or notes of changes, was color keying frames and a whole lot of essentially pins within the graph that you could easily reference and find areas that you used something like a master control, you used different parameters that are embedded in the whole list on the side. And it makes it very easy to not get lost and to figure out where you had done some custom work and to make sure that essentially going back at some later point in time for polish, feedback, or simply just passing off the graph for others to use in a different way is as easy as possible. Because whenever you're not the one who's making it, it can be a little bit obtuse as to how things were set up. So trying to make that as standardized as possible with labels, frames, pins, anything like that you can help your user easily navigate and work through these graphs, these nodes, is always a good thing. And I think that is it, and we have 5 minutes. I was so concerned about taking too long, and I just blew through it. Okay. We have 5 minutes also for Q&A.
Right before we do QA, we also want to say we are hiring, and we are hiring environment artists. So if you are interested, you should apply, and also come by our booth at GDC in the expo hall. So we will be there. A few of us will be doing critiques the next couple of days. So if you want to get in contact with us, here are our social media and emails that you can use for stuff. And, you know, it's just the three of us up here, but we represent a much larger team at Insomniac. I'll wait for to get the next photo. And so we're really lucky to be up here representing one of the best teams in the industry. We are super proud of what we were able to do with Spider-Man, given the time and the size that we had. And we hope you all enjoy the game. So, there you go. And I think we're good with questions if there are any.
Hi. My question is, on the side of your buildings, you use like a parallax occlusion, I'm assuming, like for the interior of the buildings, like you had like some kind of offset. Is that something that you used for like the interior side of your like skyscrapers to make it look like an interior?
Yeah, so for the parallax, it's, we didn't use parallax occlusion for anything in terms of like getting height depth out of anything.
Right.
But for the windows, yeah, we did use that for the cube maps.
Cool. Did that affect like optimization at all for like your game, or is it just something that your engine does specifically well? I guess my questions were. Never mind.
I don't remember that one.
I don't remember. It was pretty cheap because we did a bunch of them. So, and we were pretty cognizant of it.
That'd be a question for Josh.
Yeah, our principal environment artist, Josh Noble, who is here and will be at the booth later in the week, he's the best person because he's the one who set that stuff up.
Cool. Thank you.
I was wondering, how long did it take to do a light bake for the entirety of Manhattan? And how did you deal with seams and making sure that all went smoothly?
I don't know how to answer that. It would take a couple of weeks. We ran into some issues later in the project related to our farm, which actually made it all take a lot longer. So we had to be very smart about things and start locking things down. So yeah, theoretically a couple of weeks, but due to the problems we had later, it's kind of hard for me to say for sure. What was the other one? I'm sorry?
Oh, did you have any issues with seams between like tiles if the lights were split up that way?
No.
Yes. Well, like a light seam, right? We're talking about the light seam, no?
I'll let Ryan answer this.
Just a little near the end.
Okay.
So theoretically, it shouldn't be a problem if you're. Where it would become a problem is if you're out of sync with how you're baking different tiles. So if you were going to render a tile, you needed to render all of the surrounding tiles as well. Again, we had some farm problems later, so that could have been why that would have shown up from time to time. But for the most part, it shouldn't have.
I wasn't accusing you of having them.
I believe you were. I'm just kidding.
Hi, my question is very simple. I was wondering how you guys find the reference for the New York street or the materials.
So the question was, where do we find our reference?
Yes,
Google Street View.
just
A
Google.
lot of Google Street View, yeah. I literally had Google Street View on my monitor for years, being able to get that stuff. We would also go and find, photography. Some of us on the team did end up going to New York during production, so we were able to get some of that. But that was our main source for a lot of creation, was just using Google Street View for stuff.
I see. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Hello. My question is, what was your most favorite aspect about actually crafting New York for this Spider-Man game, since it's technically Marvel's New York and there's like landmarks within the Marvel universe that you put in for this specific rendition of New York itself? What was your just favorite aspect about crafting such a unique universe for this game?
That's all you. That's
That's you.
that's all. him.
I can name my favorite landmark, which is probably the one that I got to work on, is just the Wakandan embassy. So that was fun to do. We changed up like the Wall Street bull was, who was the character?
Lockjaw?
Yeah, it was
Lockjaw.
Lockjaw.
Yeah,
It was
so like that's a
Lockjaw.
fun little thing. I know like Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum was a lot of cool stuff. I don't know if you had a fun time lighting that. Or
Yeah,
working
no,
that. So.
all the landmarks are a lot of fun to light up, and some of them I didn't even know were going in. I would just be playing the game and see it, and I'm like, oh, I gotta light that up. So that was pretty fun.
Awesome. Thank you.
And that's it. Cool. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
what?
Okay. All right. We got one more.
Hi guys, great talk. I was just wondering if you guys ever think of future-proofing for future projects with stuff that you have here, like because some of it, you were talking about Sunset at the beginning and how you carry it over onto Spider-Man. Would you want to carry over some of these tools to your next project, et cetera?
If they work, yes.
Okay.
Depends on what the project is. So, yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Cool. That's it. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.